The next day, the family gathered at the mansion, eager to hear about the newly discovered assets. John, the oldest son, arrived first, his eyes gleaming with greed. Sarah, the shopaholic daughter, followed, already planning how to spend her share. The twins, Mike and Tom, shuffled in, looking nervous and disheveled. Mary, the troubled daughter, came last, her hands shaking slightly. As they waited, tension filled the air. John paced the room, muttering about expanding his business empire. Sarah scrolled through luxury car websites on her phone. The twins whispered to each other, discussing how to pay off their gambling debts. Mary sat alone, her mind clouded by withdrawal symptoms. Suddenly, the door opened. Everyone expected to see the lawyer. Instead, a familiar figure stepped in. The room fell silent. "Father?" Sarah gasped, her phone clattering to the floor. There stood Daniel, their supposedly dead father, very much alive. His face was stern, his eyes filled with disappointment. "Yes, it's me," Daniel said, his voice firm. "I'm not dead. I faked my death to test you all." The shock was palpable. John's jaw dropped. Sarah stumbled backward. The twins looked at each other in disbelief. Mary burst into tears. Daniel continued, "I've been watching you all. I've seen how you handled your inheritance, and I'm deeply disappointed." He turned to John. "You, my eldest. I gave you the oil company. Instead of growing it, you've been partying on yachts." John tried to speak, but Daniel cut him off. "Save it. I know everything." He looked at Sarah next. "You've spent millions on shoes and handbags. Is that how you honor my legacy?" Sarah lowered her head, unable to meet her father's gaze. Daniel addressed the twins. "Mike, Tom, you gambled away billions in less than a year. Do you have any idea how hard I worked for that money?" The twins squirmed uncomfortably. Finally, he turned to Mary. "And you, my dear? Drugs? Really? I expected better from you." Mary sobbed harder, her guilt overwhelming her. Just then, the door opened again. In walked Peter, the youngest son. Unlike the others, he looked calm and collected. Daniel's face softened. "Ah, Peter, my youngest, the one I thought least capable. You've proven me wrong." The other siblings looked at Peter with a mix of confusion and jealousy. Daniel explained, "Peter took the smallest inheritance and turned it into a thriving business. He's the only one who's made me proud." Peter stood tall, a small smile on his face. But Daniel wasn't finished. He had one more bombshell to drop. "Now listen carefully," he said. "There are no new assets to distribute. That was a lie to get you all here." The siblings gasped. John's face turned red with anger. Sarah looked like she might faint. Daniel continued, "In fact, I'm taking back control of all the companies and assets I gave you. You've proven you can't handle the responsibility." The room erupted in protests. John yelled about his rights. Sarah pleaded for another chance. The twins tried to explain their actions. Mary just cried harder. Daniel raised his hand for silence. "My decision is final, but I'm not heartless. I'm giving you all one last chance to prove yourselves." He pulled out a stack of papers. "These are job applications for entry-level positions in my companies. If you want to earn back my trust and your inheritance, you'll start from the bottom and work your way up." The siblings were stunned. John sputtered, But I was CEO." Daniel nodded. "And now you'll be a junior analyst. You'll learn the business from the ground up." Sarah looked at her application in horror. "Sales assistant, but I hate retail." "Then this will be a good learning experience," Daniel replied coolly. The twins and Mary took their applications silently, knowing they were in no position to argue. Peter stepped forward. "What about me, Father?" Daniel smiled. "You, my boy, will be my right-hand man. Together, we'll oversee the others and decide if they're worthy of another chance." The other siblings glared at Peter with envy and resentment. Daniel wasn't done yet. He had one final twist. "Oh, and one more thing. You'll all be living here in the mansion with me. I want to keep a close eye on you." The siblings looked at each other in dismay. Living under their father's watchful eye, working entry-level jobs, competing for his approval, it was a nightmare scenario. As they stood there, shocked and overwhelmed, Daniel delivered his parting shot. "Your new jobs start tomorrow. I suggest you all get a good night's sleep. You have a lot to prove." With that, he turned and left the room, leaving his children to grapple with their new reality. As night fell, the mansion was filled with a tense silence. In their rooms, the siblings plotted and schemed. John was already planning how to sabotage his siblings and regain his father's favor. Sarah was on the phone with her designer friends, begging them for jobs. The twins were Googling how to be a good employee and overcoming gambling addiction. Mary was flushing her remaining drugs down the toilet, determined to get clean. And Peter. He sat in his room, smiling to himself. He had earned his father's trust, but he knew the real challenge was just beginning. Could he help his siblings redeem themselves, or would their jealousy tear the family apart? As the clock struck midnight, Daniel stood at his window, looking out at the city. He had set his plan in motion, but even he couldn't predict how it would end. Would his children rise to the challenge, or would their greed and rivalry destroy everything he had built? Only time would tell, and Daniel was prepared to watch it all unfold, no matter how long it took. The next morning, the siblings begrudgingly reported to their new jobs. John, once a powerful CEO, now found himself sorting through data as a junior analyst. Sarah, used to shopping in high-end boutiques, struggled to keep a smile while assisting customers in a department store. The twins, Mike and Tom, were assigned to the company's logistics department, spending their days tracking shipments and managing inventory. Mary, still battling withdrawal symptoms, was given a position in the company's charitable foundation, hoping the work would aid in her recovery. Weeks turned into months, and the siblings' true colors began to show. John, despite his initial resentment, discovered he had a talent for spotting market trends that even seasoned analysts missed. Sarah's people skills, honed through years of socializing, made her a hit with customers and co-workers alike. The twins, working together, revolutionized the company's supply chain, significantly cutting costs. Mary, inspired by the foundation's work, threw herself into charity projects, finding purpose in helping others. Peter, meanwhile, watched his siblings closely, reporting their progress to Daniel. He was torn between pride in their improvements and worry that they might surpass him in their father's eyes. As the siblings worked to prove themselves, tensions in the mansion ran high. Dinner conversations often turned into heated debates about business strategies. Accusations of favoritism were thrown around, with Peter often the target of his siblings' jealousy. 6 months into this new arrangement, Daniel called a family meeting. The siblings gathered, nervous about what their father might say. Daniel looked at each of his children in turn. "I've been watching you all closely," he began, "and I must say, I'm impressed with your progress." The siblings exchanged surprised glances. "John, your market analysis has saved the company millions. Sarah, your department's sales have doubled since you started. Mike and Tom, your logistics improvements have made us industry leaders. And Mary, your work with the foundation has improved our company's reputation immensely." The siblings beamed with pride, but Daniel wasn't finished. "However," he continued, "I'm disappointed to see that you still can't work together without fighting. You've improved individually, but you're still not a team." The smiles faded from their faces. "So I have a new challenge for you," Daniel announced. "I'm dividing the company into 5 equal parts. Each of you will be in charge of one division. But here's the catch. Your success will depend on how well you cooperate with each other." The siblings looked at each other uncertainly. "If you can work together and increase the company's overall value by 50% in the next year, you'll each earn back your full inheritance. If not, everything goes to charity." The room erupted in chaos. The siblings argued about who would get which division and how they could possibly work together. Daniel raised his hand for silence. "The choice is yours. Work together or lose everything." Over the next year, the siblings faced their greatest challenge yet. They had to overcome years of rivalry and resentment to cooperate. There were heated arguments, late-night strategy sessions, and moments when it seemed impossible. But slowly, things began to change. John's market insights helped Sarah's retail division spot new trends. The twins' logistics expertise supported Mary's expansion of the foundation's reach. Peter's leadership helped coordinate their efforts. As the deadline approached, they anxiously awaited the final numbers. Had they reached their father's goal? On the day of reckoning, Daniel gathered them once again. "Well done," he said, a rare smile on his face. "Not only did you meet the 50% goal, you exceeded it. The company's value has doubled." The siblings cheered, hugging each other in genuine celebration for the first time in years. "You've earned back your inheritances," Daniel continued, "but more importantly, you've learned to work together. That's the true wealth I wanted to leave you." In that moment, the siblings realized that their father's elaborate scheme had taught them invaluable lessons. They had discovered their own strengths, learned the value of hard work, and found a way to support each other. Daniel looked at his children with pride. "Now," he said, "are you ready to lead this company together?" The siblings looked at each other, then back at their father. With newfound confidence and unity, they nodded. "Yes, Father," they said in unison, "we're ready." And so the family that had been torn apart by greed and rivalry was finally united. They had faced challenges, overcome their flaws, and emerged stronger. As they looked to the future, they knew that together they could accomplish anything. Daniel watched his children with satisfaction. His plan had worked better than he could have ever imagined. He had not only secured his business legacy, but had also restored his family. As he prepared to step back and let his children take the reins, he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together.
Please tell me, are you enjoying the story? If so, tell me, what lessons have you actually learned? I would really love to hear your comments in the comment section down below. And remember to support this channel. Please subscribe, like the video, comment, just say something. Even a word could literally mean a whole lot. So I want you to tell me, what lessons have you learned from this story? Trust me, these are situations that most people actually gone through. I'm sure some of you that are watching this story have actually gone through this situation. So I want to hear from you. I want to hear how you dealt with the situation that you were faced with.
A year had passed since Daniel's children had proven themselves capable of working together. The family business was thriving under their joint leadership, but new challenges were on the horizon. On a warm summer morning, the 5 siblings gathered in the boardroom of their company's headquarters. The view from the top floor showcased the city they had helped build. John, now the head of finance, stood at the front of the room, presenting the latest financial reports. "Our profits have increased by 30% this quarter," John announced, his voice filled with pride. "We're outperforming all our competitors." Sarah, who led the marketing department, clapped enthusiastically. "That's amazing. My team's new campaign must have really paid off." The twins, Mike and Tom, nodded in agreement. They had streamlined the company's operations to perfection. Mary, who had turned the company's charitable foundation into a powerhouse of social change, smiled softly. "And we've helped more people than ever before." Peter, who had taken on the role of CEO, looked at his siblings with a mixture of pride and concern. "Great work, everyone. But let's not forget, success can be a double-edged sword." The others looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" John asked. Peter sighed. "I've heard rumors. Our competitors are not happy with our success. They're starting to talk about unfair practices, monopolies, and all sorts of accusations." The room fell silent. They had worked so hard to get here, and now it seemed their success might be used against them. As the siblings left the boardroom, Sarah pulled John aside. "Hey, I need to talk to you about something," she said, her voice low. John raised an eyebrow. "What's up?" Sarah looked around to make sure no one was listening. "I think someone's been messing with my department's budget. Some numbers don't add up." John's face darkened. "Are you accusing me of something?" No, of course not," Sarah said quickly. "I just thought, since you're in charge of finance, you might know what's going on." John shook his head. "I'll look into it. But Sarah, be careful about throwing around accusations. We've come too far to start distrusting each other now." As John walked away, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That evening, Daniel had called for a family dinner at the mansion. It was a tradition he had started to keep the family connected outside of work. As they sat around the large dining table, tension hung in the air. Daniel noticed the strained silence and frowned. "Is everything all right?" he asked. The siblings exchanged glances. Peter cleared his throat. "We're just a bit stressed, Dad. Work stuff." Daniel nodded slowly. "I see. You know, running a business is never easy, but running it as a family, that's a whole different challenge." Mary, who had been quiet all evening, suddenly spoke up. "I'm thinking of expanding the foundation's work overseas." Her voice was hesitant, as if she was afraid of the reaction. Mike and Tom exchanged a look. "That could be complicated logistically," Mike said. "And expensive," John added. Mary's face fell. "But think of all the good we could do." Sarah jumped in. "I think it's a great idea, Mary. It could really boost our global image." As the discussion heated up, Daniel watched his children argue. He had hoped they had moved past this, but it seemed old habits died hard. The next day, as Peter arrived at his office, he found a plain brown envelope on his desk. There was no return address, no name, just confidential stamped in red on the front. With a sense of unease, Peter opened the envelope. Inside was a stack of documents. As he read through them, his face grew pale. The documents contained detailed information about the company's operations, including some questionable practices that skirted the edge of legality. Practices that Peter knew nothing about. His hands shaking, Peter picked up his phone. "We need an emergency family meeting, now." An hour later, the siblings were once again gathered in the boardroom. Peter stood at the head of the table, the documents spread out before him. "Can someone explain this to me?" he asked, his voice tight with anger. The others leaned forward, scanning the papers. John's face hardened. "Where did you get these?" "That doesn't matter," Peter snapped. "What matters is what they say. Fake charities to avoid taxes, shell companies, secret offshore accounts. Who's responsible for this?" The room erupted into chaos. Accusations flew back and forth. "It must be John," Sarah yelled. "He's in charge of finance." John stood up, his chair screeching against the floor. "How dare you? I've done nothing but help this company." "Maybe it's the twins," Mary suggested quietly. "They have access to all our shipments." Mike and Tom looked at her in disbelief. "Us? We've been busting our asses to keep this company running smoothly." As the arguing intensified, Peter slammed his hand on the table. "Enough," he shouted. The room fell silent. "Don't you see what's happening? We're falling apart. Everything we've worked for is at risk." Tears in her eyes, Sarah spoke up. "What are we going to do?" Peter took a deep breath. "First, we need to figure out who's behind this. If it's one of us, well, we'll deal with that. If it's not, we need to find out who's trying to destroy us." The siblings looked at each other, distrust clear in their eyes. The unity they had worked so hard to build was crumbling. Over the next few weeks, the siblings tried to maintain a sense of normalcy at work while secretly investigating each other. The once open and collaborative atmosphere had turned cold and suspicious. John spent hours poring over financial records, looking for any discrepancies. Sarah monitored her team closely, wondering if one of her employees might be involved. The twins doubled down on security measures, tracking every shipment with paranoid precision. Mary threw herself into her charity work, as if trying to make up for sins she hadn't committed. Peter, as CEO, felt the weight of it all on his shoulders. He had to keep the company running while also trying to uncover the truth. Late one night, as he sat in his office, surrounded by stacks of documents, there was a knock at the door. It was Daniel. "You look terrible, son," he said, concern etched on his face. Peter managed a weak smile. "Thanks, Dad. Just what I needed to hear." Daniel sat down across from him. "Want to tell me what's going on?" For a moment, Peter was tempted to spill everything, but something held him back. "It's just business stress," he lied. "Nothing we can't handle." Daniel didn't look convinced, but he didn't push. "All right. But remember, Peter, family is everything. Don't let anything come between you and your siblings." As Daniel left, Peter felt a pang of guilt. He was keeping secrets from his father, just like someone was keeping secrets from him. A month into their secret investigation, Sarah made a breakthrough. She had been going through old email archives when she found something strange. Emails between one of the company's smaller subsidiaries and an unknown entity discussing large money transfers. Her heart racing, Sarah dug deeper. The subsidiary was managed by Tom. With shaking hands, she picked up her phone and called Peter. An hour later, the siblings were once again gathered in the boardroom. The atmosphere was tense as Sarah presented her findings. "I don't want to believe it," she said, her voice trembling, "but the evidence, it all points to Tom." All eyes turned to Tom. His face was pale, his eyes wide. I can explain," he stuttered. Mike jumped to his feet. "Explain what? That you've been stealing from us? Betraying your own family?" Tom stood up, backing away from the table. "You don't understand. I had no choice." "No choice?" John scoffed. "There's always a choice." As the others closed in on Tom, Peter noticed something odd. Mary, usually so vocal about injustice, was sitting quietly, her eyes fixed on the table. "Mary," Peter said softly, "is there something you want to say?" All eyes turned to Mary. She looked up, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." The room fell silent as the implications of Mary's words sank in. It wasn't just Tom. Mary was involved too. Through her tears, Mary began to explain. "It started a few months ago. A man approached Tom and me. He said he had evidence of illegal activities in our company from before we took over. He threatened to expose everything unless we cooperated." Tom nodded, his face a mask of guilt and fear. "We didn't know what to do. We thought we could handle it ourselves, protect the family." "So you committed actual crimes to cover up imaginary ones?" John asked, his voice cold. Mary shook her head. "We didn't think we had a choice. This man, he seemed to know everything about us. He said if we didn't do what he wanted, he'd destroy the company and tear our family apart." The other siblings listened in shock as Mary and Tom detailed the extent of their actions. The fake charities, the money laundering, the offshore accounts, all done under duress, they claimed. Peter, his mind reeling, asked the question they were all thinking. "Who is this man? Why is he doing this to us?" Tom and Mary exchanged a look. "We don't know his real name," Tom said. "He calls himself the Architect." The revelation of Tom and Mary's betrayal sent shockwaves through the family. Daniel was informed, and his disappointment was palpable. The trust that had been so carefully rebuilt over the past year had been shattered. In the weeks that followed, the family tried to grapple with this new reality. Tom and Mary were suspended from their positions in the company, pending a full investigation. The other siblings worked tirelessly to undo the damage and protect the company from potential legal repercussions. But the emotional toll was even greater than the financial one. Family dinners, once a time of laughter and connection, were now silent, tense affairs. The siblings could barely look at each other across the table. One evening, as they picked at their food in uncomfortable silence, Daniel cleared his throat. "I think it's time we faced this head-on," he said. "We need to find this architect and put an end to this." The siblings looked at him in surprise. John spoke up. "But how? We don't even know where to start." Daniel's eyes hardened with determination. "We start by sticking together. This person, whoever they are, they wanted to tear us apart. We can't let them succeed." For the first time in weeks, the siblings felt a glimmer of hope. They had overcome challenges before. They could do it again. Over the next few days, the family worked together to formulate a plan. They would set a trap for the architect, using the company as bait. Peter, as CEO, would publicly announce a major new initiative, one that would be too tempting for the architect to resist. They would leak information about secret meetings and large money transfers, hoping to draw their enemy out. Meanwhile, John and Sarah would work with their contacts in the financial world and media to spread the word. The twins would use their logistics expertise to track any unusual movements or communications. Mary, desperate to make amends, threw herself into the plan. She used her connections in the charity world to gather information on any suspicious activities that might be linked to the architect. As they worked, the siblings began to reconnect. The shared goal of protecting their family and company helped bridge the gap that had formed between them. 2 weeks later, everything was in place. Peter stood before a crowd of reporters, cameras flashing as he announced the company's plans to expand into a new, highly regulated industry. Behind the scenes, the family waited anxiously for the architect to make his move. Days passed with no sign of their enemy. The siblings began to worry that their plan had failed. But then, late one night, as Peter was about to leave the office, his computer pinged with a new email. The subject line read, "I know what you're doing." With shaking hands, Peter opened the email. The message was short. "Did you really think you could outsmart me? I made you. I can destroy you just as easily. Meet me tomorrow night at the old factory on the edge of town. Come alone, or your precious family will pay the price." Peter's heart raced as he read the words. This was it. The architect had taken the bait, but as he reached for his phone to call his siblings, he hesitated. The email had said to come alone. If he told his family, would he be putting them in danger? But if he went alone, he'd be walking into a trap. As Peter stood there, the weight of the decision heavy on his shoulders, he realized that everything, his family, the company, their future, hinged on what he did next. The clock ticked loudly in the quiet office. Peter took a deep breath and made his choice. He picked up his phone and dialed. "Hello?" John's voice answered. Peter paused for a moment, then spoke. "John, I need you to listen carefully. Something's happened." Peter's hand trembled as he held the phone. John's voice crackled through the speaker. "Peter, what's going on?" Taking a deep breath, Peter made his decision. "John, I need you to gather everyone. Family meeting at the mansion in an hour. It's urgent." "Got it," John replied, concern evident in his voice. "We'll be there." As Peter drove to the family mansion, his mind raced. He knew he was taking a risk by involving his siblings, but the thought of facing the architect alone terrified him. They had promised to stand together, and now was the time to prove it. An hour later, the siblings gathered in the living room of the mansion. Daniel sat in his favorite armchair, watching his children with a mix of concern and curiosity. Peter stood before them, the email from the architect displayed on the large screen behind him. "We've got a situation," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. As Peter explained the email and the demand to meet alone, he watched the reactions of his siblings. John's fists clenched in anger. Sarah gasped, her hand covering her mouth. The twins exchanged worried glances. Mary, still dealing with the guilt of her earlier betrayal, looked pale and scared. "You can't go alone," Sarah said firmly. "It's too dangerous." John nodded in agreement. "We're in this together, remember?" Daniel leaned forward in his chair. "Peter, your siblings are right. This architect fellow, he's trying to isolate you. Don't let him." Peter felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had made the right choice in telling them. "Okay," he said. Then we need a plan. For the next few hours, the family worked together to devise a strategy. They would make it appear as if Peter was coming alone, but the others would be nearby, ready to intervene if needed. John suggested using some of his contacts in private security to set up surveillance around the meeting point. Sarah proposed a social media campaign to draw attention to the area, making it harder for the architect to try anything without witnesses. The twins, Mike and Tom, offered to use their logistics expertise to map out every possible escape route from the old factory. Mary, eager to contribute, volunteered to reach out to her charity contacts to gather any information about recent suspicious activities in the area. As the night wore on, the plan took shape. For the first time in weeks, the siblings felt united, their earlier mistrust fading in the face of this common threat. The next evening, Peter stood outside the old factory, his heart pounding. He was wired with a hidden microphone, allowing his siblings to hear everything from their positions nearby. "I'm going in," Peter murmured, knowing his family could hear him. "Be careful," Sarah's voice crackled in his earpiece. Peter pushed open the rusty door of the factory. The interior was dark, with only a few shafts of moonlight breaking through the dusty windows. His footsteps echoed in the empty space. "Hello, Peter," a voice called out from the shadows. "I'm glad you could make it." Peter squinted, trying to see the speaker. "Show yourself," he demanded, his voice steadier than he felt. A figure stepped into a patch of moonlight. Peter's breath caught in his throat. The man before him was older, probably in his 60s, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes. But what shocked Peter most was the sense of familiarity. He knew this man, but from where? "Who are you?" Peter asked, his mind racing. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You can call me the architect, but I think you might know me by another name." Suddenly it clicked. Peter stumbled back, his eyes wide with shock. "Uncle Richard." In the van parked a block away, the other siblings gasped. Uncle Richard had been their father's younger brother, estranged from the family for years. They had all assumed he was dead. Back in the factory, Richard nodded. "Very good, Peter. I always knew you were the smart one." Peter's shock turned to anger. "Why? Why are you doing this to us?" Richard's face hardened. "Your father took everything from me. We built this company together, but he pushed me out, stole my ideas. I've spent years planning my revenge." "So you blackmailed Tom and Mary, threatened our company?" Peter's voice rose with each question. Richard shrugged. "I had to get your attention somehow, and look how well it worked. Here you are, the mighty CEO, sneaking around in an abandoned factory." Peter's mind was reeling. All this time, the threat had been coming from within their own family. "What do you want?" he asked, trying to buy time. "What do I want?" Richard laughed bitterly. "I want what's rightfully mine. Half of the company to start with, and a public acknowledgement of my role in building this empire." Peter shook his head. "You're insane. You think after everything you've done, we'd just hand over half the company?" Richard's eyes glinted dangerously. "Oh, you will. Unless you want the world to know about all the dirty little secrets I've uncovered. Your father's questionable deals, your siblings' recent indiscretions. I have enough dirt to bury your family's reputation forever." Suddenly, there was a commotion outside. Richard's head snapped towards the sound. "You didn't come alone, did you?" he snarled. Before Peter could respond, the factory doors burst open. John, Sarah, the twins, and Mary rushed in, followed by a team of security guards. "It's over, Uncle Richard," John called out. "We heard everything." Richard's face contorted with rage. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a gun. "Stay back," he shouted, pointing the weapon at Peter. The siblings froze, their faces pale with fear. Peter raised his hands slowly. "Uncle Richard, please, think about what you're doing." For a moment, the factory was silent except for Richard's heavy breathing. Then a new voice cut through the tension. "Richard, put the gun down." Everyone turned to see Daniel standing in the doorway, his face a mask of sorrow and determination. Richard's hand trembled, the gun still pointed at Peter. "Daniel," he spat, "come to save your precious children." Daniel stepped forward slowly, his hands raised. "I've come to end this, Richard. It's gone on long enough." As the brothers faced each other, years of resentment and unspoken words hung in the air between them. The siblings watched, hardly daring to breathe, as their father approached their estranged uncle. "You're right," Daniel said softly. "I did push you out. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Richard's eyes widened in surprise. The gun lowered slightly. Daniel continued, "But this isn't the way to make it right. Look at what you're doing, Richard. Threatening your own family. Is this really what you want?" For a long moment, Richard stood frozen, conflict clear on his face. Then slowly, he lowered the gun. As soon as the weapon was down, the security team moved in, disarming Richard and restraining him. The siblings rushed to Peter, enveloping him in a group hug. Daniel watched as his brother was led away, his face a mixture of relief and regret. The family crisis had been averted, but at what cost? In the days that followed, the family grappled with the fallout from Richard's actions. Legal teams worked around the clock to untangle the web of blackmail and corporate espionage. The siblings worked together to address the issues in the company that Richard had exploited. One evening, as the family sat around the dinner table, Daniel cleared his throat. "I owe you all an apology," he said. "I should have told you about Richard years ago. My silence put you all in danger." The siblings exchanged glances. It was Peter who spoke up. "We understand, Dad. Family is complicated." Daniel nodded, his eyes misting. "Yes, it is. But I've learned something from all this. Secrets and lies, they only breed more pain. From now on, we need to be honest with each other, no matter how difficult it might be." The others murmured in agreement. They had all learned hard lessons about trust and communication. As they continued their meal, the conversation turned to the future of the company. There was still much to be done to repair the damage Richard had caused, both to the business and to their family relationships. But as Peter looked around the table, he felt a glimmer of hope. They had faced this crisis together and come out stronger. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as a family. Weeks passed and life began to return to normal. The company was recovering and the siblings were slowly rebuilding their trust in each other. One afternoon, as Peter was working late in his office, his secretary buzzed in. "Mr. Coleman, there's someone here to see you. He says it's urgent." Peter frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. "Who is it?" There was a pause. "He says he's your cousin, Jack Coleman." Peter's breath caught in his throat. Jack, Uncle Richard's son. They hadn't seen or heard from Jack in years, not since Richard's estrangement from the family. "Send him in," Peter said, his mind racing. The door opened and a young man walked in. He looked to be in his late 20s, with the same piercing blue eyes as Richard. But where Richard's eyes had been cold and calculating, Jack's were filled with uncertainty and a hint of fear. "Hello, Peter," Jack said hesitantly. I need your help." Peter stood, unsure whether to greet his cousin with a handshake or remain cautious. "Jack, it's been a long time. What's going on?" Jack ran a hand through his hair, clearly agitated. "It's about my father. There's something you need to know, something big." As Peter listened to Jack's words, his blood ran cold. It seemed their family's troubles were far from over. "We need to call a family meeting," Peter said, reaching for his phone. "Right now." Peter paced nervously in the living room of the family mansion, waiting for the others to arrive. Jack sat on the couch, his eyes darting around the room, taking in the family photos and expensive decor. One by one, the siblings filed in. John arrived first, his face set in a frown as he eyed Jack suspiciously. Sarah followed, offering Jack a hesitant smile. The twins, Mike and Tom, entered together, their usual synchronized movements betraying their unease. Mary was the last to arrive, her eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. Daniel entered the room last, his presence immediately commanding attention. He paused when he saw Jack, surprise and a hint of pain crossing his face. "Jack," he said softly, "it's been a long time." Jack stood, awkwardly shifting his weight. "Hello, Uncle Daniel. I'm sorry to barge in like this." Daniel waved off the apology. "Your family, you're always welcome here." He turned to Peter. "What's going on, son?" Peter took a deep breath. Jack has some information about Uncle Richard, information that could change everything. All eyes turned to Jack, who swallowed hard under the weight of their stares. "My father," Jack began, his voice shaky, "he's been planning this for years. The blackmail, the threats, it was all just the beginning." Sarah leaned forward. "What do you mean, the beginning?" Jack looked around the room, his eyes filled with guilt. "There's a bigger plan. Dad, he's not working alone. He's part of a group, a network of disgruntled former executives and business rivals. They call themselves the Syndicate." The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Daniel raised a hand for silence. "Go on, Jack," he said, his voice grave. "The Syndicate's goal isn't just to take over your company," Jack continued. "They want to reshape the entire industry. They've been manipulating markets, buying off politicians, even sabotaging competitors. And your company is their biggest target." John jumped to his feet. "How do you know all this? How do we know we can trust you?" Jack's face crumpled. Because I was part of it. My father groomed me to be his successor in the Syndicate. But I can't do it anymore. What they're planning, it's wrong. People could get hurt." The room fell silent as the family processed this bombshell. Peter looked at his father, seeing the weight of this new threat settling on Daniel's shoulders. Daniel stood, his eyes sweeping across the room. "First, I want to thank you, Jack, for coming to us with this information. I know it couldn't have been easy." Jack nodded, relief visible on his face. "Now," Daniel continued, "we need to decide what to do with this information. The stakes have just gotten a lot higher." Peter spoke up. "We need to go to the authorities. This is bigger than us now." "No," Jack exclaimed, panic in his voice. "The Syndicate has people everywhere. If they find out I've talked, my life won't be worth anything." Sarah put a comforting hand on Jack's shoulder. "We won't let anything happen to you, Jack. Your family." John scoffed. "Family? We barely know him. For all we know, this could be another trick." The room erupted into arguments, with the siblings taking sides. Daniel watched, a sad smile on his face. Finally, he raised his voice. "Enough." The room fell silent once more. "We will not be divided on this," Daniel said firmly. "We've come too far, faced too much together to let this tear us apart now. We will help Jack, and we will fight this Syndicate. But we'll do it smart, and we'll do it together." The siblings looked at each other, a mix of determination and fear on their faces. They knew their father was right. This was a fight they couldn't afford to lose. Over the next few hours, the family worked together to formulate a strategy. They would gather evidence, quietly reach out to trusted contacts in law enforcement, and prepare for the fight ahead. Peter would lead the corporate side, shoring up the company's defenses and looking for any signs of infiltration. John and Sarah would use their connections in finance and media to gather intelligence on the Syndicate's operations. The twins would be in charge of security, both physical and digital. Mary would use her charity contacts to keep an ear to the ground for any rumors or suspicious activities. As for Jack, he would work closely with Daniel, providing as much information as he could about the Syndicate's structure and plans. As the night wore on, a sense of purpose filled the room. They had faced challenges before, but this was different. This was a fight for their family's legacy and for the future of the industry they had helped shape. A week later, the family gathered again to share their findings. The news was grim. The Syndicate's influence ran deeper than they had imagined, with tentacles reaching into government agencies, major corporations, and even international markets. "We need to make a move soon," Peter said, looking at the evidence they had gathered. "If we wait too long, it might be too late." Daniel nodded. "I agree, but we need to be careful. One wrong move and we could lose everything." Whatever happened next? There was no turning back now.
If you made it to the end of part 2 of this thrilling story, then all I can say is congratulations and thank you. These videos really take a lot of time to make, but you guys' support really keep me going. Comments below and share this video with your friends and family. Also, like and subscribe to the channel so that you'll be the first to be notified when I drop a new video.
Daniel nodded. "I agree, but we need to be careful. One wrong move and we could lose everything." Suddenly, Sarah's phone buzzed. She looked at it, her face paling. "Guys," she said, her voice shaking, "you need to see this." She turned on the TV, flipping to a news channel. The anchor was in the middle of breaking news. Allegations of widespread corruption and market manipulation. Among the companies named in this explosive report is Coleman Enterprises. Sources close to the investigation suggest that the company's recent success may be built on a foundation of illegal activities. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. The syndicate had made their move, and they had struck first. Daniel's face hardened. "So be it," he said, his voice filled with determination. "If it's a war they want, it's a war they'll get." Peter looked around at his siblings, at Jack, and finally at his father. He saw fear in their eyes, yes, but also resolve. They had fought to keep their family together, to build something meaningful. They wouldn't let it be destroyed without a fight. "What's our next move, Dad?" Peter asked. Daniel stood, his eyes blazing with a fire that belied his age. "We fight back. We use every resource we have, every connection, every bit of knowledge. We expose the syndicate for what they are." The siblings nodded, ready for the battle ahead. "But remember," Daniel continued, his voice softening, "no matter what happens, we stick together. We're family. That's our strength, and that's what they can never take away from us." As the family began to mobilize, putting their plan into action, they knew that the coming days would test them like never before. The fate of their company, their reputation, and perhaps even their freedom hung in the balance. But as Peter looked around at his family, he felt a surge of hope. They had overcome so much already. Together, they just might be strong enough to weather this storm too. Little did they know, the true test of their unity was yet to come. As the family worked tirelessly to counter the syndicate's attack, a new threat was brewing from within. In the shadows of the mansion, a figure moved silently, eavesdropping on conversations and rifling through documents. This person, a member of the family inner circle, had been feeding information to the syndicate for months. Their motivations were complex, a mix of resentment, greed, and a misguided sense of justice. As they listened to the family's plans, a pang of guilt struck their heart. But it was too late to turn back now. They had made their choice, and now they had to see it through. Slipping out of the mansion under cover of darkness, the mole made a phone call. "It's me," they whispered. "I have new information. The family is planning something big. We need to move fast." On the other end of the line, a cold voice responded, "Excellent. Keep us informed. Remember, when this is over, you'll have everything you were promised. Don't let your conscience get in the way now." As they ended the call, the mole looked back at the mansion. The windows glowed warmly, a stark contrast to the cold dread in their heart. They had set events in motion that could destroy the family they had once loved. But who was this traitor in the family's midst? And could they be stopped before it was too late? The Coleman family mansion was a hive of activity. In the wake of the public accusations against their company, the family had transformed their home into a war room. The dining room table was covered with laptops, documents, and empty coffee cups. The air was thick with tension and determination. Peter stood at the head of the table, addressing his siblings and Jack. We need to find out who leaked that information to the press. It had to come from someone with inside knowledge. John nodded grimly. I've been going through our security logs. Someone's been accessing sensitive files late at night, but they're good. They've covered their tracks well, Sarah chimed in. I've reached out to my media contacts. The story came from an anonymous source, but the journalist who broke it is known for having connections to some shady characters. Daniel, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. We need to consider the possibility that the leak came from within our family. The room fell silent. The idea that one of them could be a traitor was almost unthinkable. Mary, her voice shaking slightly, asked, "What do we do, Dad?" Daniel's eyes were hard as he surveyed his children. We trust no one outside this room. We watch each other's backs, and we find this mole, no matter what it takes. As days passed, the pressure on the Coleman family intensified. The company's stock was in freefall, business partners were distancing themselves, and reporters camped outside their offices and homes. The mole, feeling the weight of their actions, struggled to maintain their composure. They continued to feed information to the syndicate, but each betrayal felt like a knife twisting in their gut. One evening, as the family gathered for a strategy session, Tom noticed something odd. "Hey, has anyone seen my laptop? I could have sworn I left it here." The room tensed. Missing equipment could mean a security breach. Mike jumped up. "I'll check the security cameras." As Mike left, Peter's phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "Your time is running out. Surrender now or watch your empire crumble." Peter showed the message to the others. Sarah gasped. "They're toying with us now." Jack, who had been quiet lately, spoke up. "We need to strike back, hard. I might have an idea." Jack's plan was audacious and dangerous. He proposed using himself as bait to draw out members of the syndicate. By pretending to have a change of heart and wanting to rejoin them, he could potentially gather crucial evidence. The family was divided. John argued vehemently against it, citing the risks. Sarah and Mary supported Jack, admiring his bravery. The twins were uncertain, seeing both the potential benefits and dangers. Peter looked to his father for guidance. Daniel was silent for a long moment before speaking. "It's Jack's decision, but if he does this, he won't be alone. We'll have his back every step of the way." Jack nodded, a mix of fear and determination in his eyes. "I'll do it. It's time I made up for my past mistakes." As the family began to plan the details of the operation, the mole felt a surge of panic. This could expose everything. They needed to warn the syndicate, but how to do it without revealing themselves? The plan was set in motion. Jack, wired with a hidden microphone and tracked by the twins' advanced tech, made contact with his old syndicate connections. He spun a tale of disillusionment with the Colemans and a desire to return to the fold. The family listened anxiously as Jack navigated the dangerous waters of the syndicate. He was good, playing his role convincingly. But would it be enough? As Jack was led to a meeting with higher-ranking syndicate members, the tension in the Coleman war room was palpable. They were finally going to get some answers. But suddenly, Jack's audio feed crackled and went dead. "We've lost him," Mike shouted, frantically trying to re-establish the connection. Peter was already grabbing his coat. "We're going in, now." As Peter, John, and the twins raced to Jack's last known location, Sarah and Mary stayed behind with Daniel to coordinate and handle any fallout. The mole, seeing their chance, slipped away in the chaos. They had to warn the syndicate. But as they reached for their secret phone, a hand grasped their wrist. "Going somewhere?" Daniel's voice was cold as ice. The mole turned slowly, their heart pounding. Daniel stood there, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and deep sadness. "How long have you known?" the mole asked, their voice barely a whisper. Daniel's grip tightened. "Long enough. I wanted to be wrong. I prayed I was wrong." Sarah and Mary, alerted by the commotion, rushed into the room. Their eyes widened in shock as they saw who Daniel had caught. "You?" Sarah gasped. "But why?" Before the mole could answer, Peter's voice crackled over the radio. "Dad, we've got Jack. He's okay, but shaken up. We're on our way back. And we've got company. Syndicate members in custody." Daniel never took his eyes off the mole. "Good, because we've got some questions that need answering." Hours later, the family was reunited in the war room. Jack, looking battered but alive, sat with an ice pack on his head. Several grim-faced men in suits, the captured syndicate members, were seated under guard in the corner. And in the center of it all stood the mole, facing the family they had betrayed. Peter, his voice tight with controlled anger, spoke first. "Why? After everything we've been through, everything we've built together, why would you do this?" The mole looked around the room, seeing the hurt and betrayal on every face. Finally, they began to speak, their story spilling out in a torrent of words. As the truth emerged, the family listened in stunned silence. The mole's motivations were a complex web of old resentments, misunderstood slights, and a gradual seduction by the syndicate's promises of power and recognition. "I never meant for it to go this far," the mole finished, tears streaming down their face. "I thought I could fix things, make them right. But it all spiraled out of control." Daniel, who had been silent throughout the confession, finally spoke. "Actions have consequences. You've put this family, your family, in danger. That's not something that can be easily forgiven." The room fell silent as the weight of the situation sank in. The family had survived external threats, but this betrayal from within had shaken them to their core. Peter looked at his father. "What do we do now?" Daniel's face was a mask of conflicting emotions. "We have a decision to make. Do we turn them over to the authorities, try to handle this internally? Or—" He left the last option unspoken, but everyone understood. Forgiveness. It seemed impossible, and yet, as the family grappled with this monumental decision, they knew that their choice would define them for years to come. Could they find a way to heal this deep wound? Or would this betrayal be the thing that finally tore the Coleman family apart? While the family debated the fate of the mole, Jack cleared his throat. All eyes turned to him. "During my time with the syndicate," he began hesitantly, "I managed to download some files. I think they might be enough to clear the company's name and expose the syndicate's real activities." A spark of hope ignited in the room. Peter leaned forward eagerly. "What kind of files?" Jack pulled out a flash drive. "Financial records, emails, plans for future operations, everything." The family exchanged glances. This could change everything. But as they looked at the mole, still standing in the center of the room, they knew they had another pressing issue to resolve. Daniel stood up, his face resolute. "Before we deal with the syndicate, we need to deal with our own. It's time to make a decision." As the family turned to face the mole, the air crackled with tension. The next few moments would determine not just the fate of one person, but the future of the entire Coleman family. What would they choose? Punishment or forgiveness? Justice or mercy? And whatever they decided, could the family ever truly heal from this betrayal? The Coleman family stood in a tense circle, their eyes fixed on the mole in their midst. The weight of their decision hung heavy in the air. Daniel, his face etched with lines of sorrow and determination, spoke first. "Before we decide, I want to hear from everyone. This affects us all, and we'll make this choice as a family." Peter stepped forward, his voice tight with controlled anger. "What they did, it's unforgivable. They put everything we've worked for at risk. I say we turn them over to the authorities." John nodded in agreement. "Peter's right. We can't just let this go. Actions have consequences." Sarah, her eyes brimming with unshed tears, spoke next. I understand the anger, I feel it too. But their family, can we really turn our backs on them? Mary, who had been silent until now, added softly, "We've all made mistakes, maybe not this big, but shouldn't we at least consider forgiveness?" The twins exchanged a look before Mike spoke for both of them. "Whatever we decide, we need to make sure this never happens again. We need safeguards." All eyes turned to Jack, the newest addition to their family circle. He shifted uncomfortably under their gaze. I know what it's like to be on the wrong side, to want a second chance, but I also know the damage the syndicate can do. It's not an easy choice." Finally, Daniel turned to the mole. "You've heard what everyone has to say. Do you have anything to add before we make our decision?" The mole, their face a mask of regret and fear, spoke in a trembling voice. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. What I did was wrong, and I'll accept whatever punishment you think is right. I want you to know how sorry I am, for everything." Daniel nodded slowly, then turned back to his family. "We've heard from everyone. Now we need to decide. But remember, whatever we choose, we do it together. We stand united." The family huddled closer, their voices low as they debated. The mole stood alone, awaiting their fate. After what seemed like an eternity, the family broke their huddle. Daniel stepped forward, his face solemn. "We've made our decision," he announced. "We won't be turning you over to the authorities." The mole's eyes widened in surprise and relief. "But," Daniel continued, his voice firm, "that doesn't mean there won't be consequences. You've broken our trust, and that's not something easily repaired." Peter took over, outlining their decision. "You'll be under constant supervision. You'll work to help us take down the syndicate using your inside knowledge. And you'll undergo intensive therapy to work through whatever issues led you to betray us in the first place." John added, "You'll have no access to sensitive information or decision-making processes until you've proven yourself trustworthy again, and that could take years." Sarah stepped forward, her voice softer but no less resolute. "We're giving you a second chance, but it's the only one you'll get. Betray us again, and there won't be any more forgiveness." The mole nodded, tears streaming down their face. "Thank you. I promise I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." Daniel's face softened slightly. "It won't be easy for any of us, but we're family, and family doesn't give up on each other. Now let's focus on taking down the syndicate." With their internal crisis addressed, the Coleman family turned their attention to the threat of the syndicate. Jack's stolen files proved to be a goldmine of information, revealing the full extent of the syndicate's operations. Peter took charge of analyzing the financial data, working with John to trace the money trails. Sarah used her media contacts to prepare a carefully crafted exposé, ready to be released at the right moment. The twins bolstered their security measures, anticipating retaliation from the syndicate. Mary, drawing on her experience with the family's charitable foundation, began reaching out to the victims of the syndicate's schemes, gathering testimonies that would prove crucial in the coming legal battles. Daniel, with his years of business experience, coordinated their efforts, ensuring that every move they made was calculated and effective. The mole, true to their word, provided valuable insights into the syndicate's methods and weaknesses. While still under close watch, they threw themselves into the work, desperate to prove their commitment to redemption. As their plan took shape, Peter couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Despite everything they'd been through, the family was working together better than ever before. They had faced betrayal and come out stronger. Just as the Colemans were preparing to launch their counterattack, the syndicate made their move. A series of coordinate cyber attacks hit the family's business interests, threatening to cripple their operations. The twins sprang into action, their fingers flying over keyboards as they fought to repel the digital assault. "They're good," Tom muttered, sweat beading on his forehead. "But we're better." While the twins battled in cyberspace, physical threats emerged as well. Suspicious figures were spotted surveilling the family's homes and offices. John took charge of security, coordinating with trusted contacts in law enforcement to ensure the family's safety. Sarah found herself in the media crosshairs as syndicate-linked journalists launched a smear campaign against her. But she stood firm, using her own network to counter their lies with truth. Through it all, the family stood united. Each attack only strengthened their resolve. After weeks of intense preparation and fending off syndicate attacks, the Colemans were ready to make their move. They had compiled an airtight case against the syndicate, complete with financial records, witness testimonies, and irrefutable evidence of their crimes. On a crisp morning, Peter stood before a phalanx of reporters, cameras flashing as he made his announcement. Today, we are releasing evidence of a vast criminal conspiracy that has been manipulating markets, corrupting officials, and destroying lives. We call on law enforcement agencies worldwide to act on this information and bring these criminals to justice. As Peter spoke, Sarah's meticulously crafted exposé hit the press. John and the twins coordinated with law enforcement for simultaneous raids on syndicate operations across the globe. Mary stood with the victims, giving a human face to the damage the syndicate had caused. Daniel watched it all unfold, a mixture of pride and weariness on his face. They had done it. They had faced betrayal, overcome their own flaws, and were now on the verge of taking down a criminal empire. But as the family gathered to watch the news of syndicate arrests rolling in, Jack burst into the room, his face pale. "We've got a problem," he gasped. "A big one." Jack's news hit the family like a thunderbolt. "Uncle Richard," he said, his voice shaking, "he's escaped custody, and he's not alone." Security footage showed Richard being broken out of the high-security facility where he was being held. The operation was slick, professional, clearly the work of syndicate loyalists who had evaded the worldwide crackdown. But that wasn't the worst of it. Jack pulled up an image on his tablet, and the family gasped in unison. There, standing next to Richard as he was hustled into a waiting car, was a familiar face. "Is that?" Sarah began, unable to finish the sentence. Peter nodded grimly. "Grandpa Joe, Dad's father." All eyes turned to Daniel, whose face had gone ashen. That's impossible," he whispered. "My father died years ago, before any of this started." But the evidence was right there in front of them. Grandpa Joe, looking older but very much alive, was clearly working with the syndicate. And now he and Richard were in the wind, with who knew how many syndicate resources still at their disposal. The family stood in shocked silence, the euphoria of their victory over the syndicate evaporating in an instant. They had thought the war was over, but it seemed it was only entering a new, more personal phase. Peter was the first to recover. "All right," he said, his voice steady despite the shock. "We need to regroup. Now we know who we're really up against." Daniel nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the image of his supposedly dead father. "All this time," he murmured, "all this time, he was behind it all." As the family began to mobilize, adapting their plans to this new threat, they couldn't shake the feeling that everything they thought they knew had just been turned upside down. The roots of this conspiracy ran deeper than any of them had imagined, straight into the heart of their own family history. What secrets had Grandpa Joe been keeping all these years? Why had he faked his own death? And most importantly, how were they going to stop him and Uncle Richard before they could rebuild the syndicate and seek revenge? As night fell, the Coleman family found themselves facing their greatest challenge yet. The war wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. And this time, it was personal. The revelation that Grandpa Joe, Daniel's long-dead father, was alive and working with the escaped Uncle Richard sent shockwaves through the Coleman family. After their hard-fought victory over the syndicate, they now faced an even more personal and treacherous enemy. Peter paced the room, his mind racing. How is this possible? Grandpa Joe was supposed to be dead. Daniel, his face etched with a mix of disbelief and anger, spoke up. I attended his funeral myself. I don't understand. Sarah placed a comforting hand on her father's arm. Dad, you have to know. None of this is your fault. Grandpa Joe obviously had his reasons for faking his own death. John, ever the pragmatist, jumped in. We need to find him, and fast, before he and Richard can regroup and rebuild the syndicate. The twins, Mike and Tom, exchanged a concerned glance. But how? Mike asked. We've got no leads, no idea where they could be. All eyes turned to Jack, who had remained silent since delivering the shocking news. Jack, Peter said, you were part of the syndicate. Do you have any idea where they might have gone? Jack shook his head, his face etched with guilt. I'm sorry, I don't know. My father and grandfather kept me out of the loop on a lot of their plans. Mary, who had been quietly contemplating the situation, spoke up. Then we need to start digging. Comb through old records, family archives, anything that might give us a clue. Daniel nodded, his resolve hardening. Mary's right. We've faced challenges before, and we'll face this one together. No more secrets, no more lies. We'll uncover the truth, no matter what it takes. The family set to work, their determination fueled by a mix of fear and fury. They refused to let their grandfather and uncle destroy everything they had built. This was personal now, a battle for the very soul of their family. Days turned into weeks as they meticulously pored over every scrap of information they could find. The mole, true to their word, provided valuable insights, risking the wrath of their former syndicate allies to make amends. But despite their best efforts, the trail remained frustratingly cold. Grandpa Joe and Uncle Richard had covered their tracks well, seemingly vanishing into the shadows. Peter, his eyes strained from endless hours of research, slumped in his chair. It's like they've disappeared into thin air. John placed a hand on his brother's shoulder. We'll find them, Peter. We have to. Sarah, her voice laced with worry, chimed in. But what if we're too late? What if they've already started rebuilding the syndicate? The family fell silent, the weight of that possibility hanging heavily in the air. Suddenly, Mary's eyes lit up. Wait, I think I found something. She hurried to the computer, her fingers flying across the keyboard. The others gathered around, their hearts pounding with anticipation. Mary turned to them, her expression a mix of excitement and trepidation. I think I know where they are. Daniel leaned forward, his gaze intense. Where? The old family cabin, Mary said, her voice barely above a whisper. The one Grandpa Joe used to take us to when we were kids. The siblings exchanged a somber look. That cabin held so many memories, both good and bad. It had been a place of solace, but also the site of countless arguments between their grandfather and father. Peter stood, determination etched on his face. Then that's where we're going. We end this, once and for all. As the family prepared to confront their past, the weight of the decision settled heavily on their shoulders. They knew that whatever happened, nothing would ever be the same again. The journey to the remote cabin was tense and silent. The siblings stole anxious glances at one another, each lost in their own thoughts. Daniel, his lips set in a grim line, drove with a single-minded focus. When they finally reached the familiar weathered structure, a hush fell over the group. Peter turned to his father. Are you ready for this? Daniel's eyes hardened with resolve. I have to be. For all of us. The family approached the cabin, their senses heightened, anticipating an ambush. But as they drew closer, they noticed the eerie silence. No sounds, no signs of life. Cautiously, they pushed open the door and stepped inside. The interior was shrouded in a thick layer of dust, untouched for what seemed like years. A chill ran down their spines. Where are they? John whispered, his hand gripping the gun hidden beneath his jacket. Daniel led the way deeper into the cabin, the floorboards creaking under his weight. The siblings followed, their eyes darting around the dimly lit space, searching for any sign of their missing relatives. Suddenly, a floorboard squeaked behind them. They whirled around, their weapons drawn, only to be met with the barrel of a gun. "Hello, my dear family," a voice drawled, dripping with contempt. "I've been expecting you." There, standing before them, was Grandpa Joe, a twisted smile on his face. Behind him, Uncle Richard emerged from the shadows, his eyes gleaming with malice. The Colemans stood frozen, caught off guard by the unexpected confrontation. Grandpa Joe chuckled, a hollow, mirthless sound. "Did you really think you could outsmart me?" Daniel stepped forward, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped him. "Father, what is the meaning of this? Why are you alive? Why are you working with Richard?" Grandpa Joe's eyes narrowed. "Oh, Daniel, always the dutiful son, trying to follow in my footsteps. But you never had the vision, the ambition that I did." He paced the room, his gaze sweeping over the siblings. "All of you, so content with your little family business. Your pathetic attempts at philanthropy. You have no idea of the power that was within your grasp." Richard moved to stand beside Grandpa Joe, his lips curled in a sneer. "That's where we come in. We're going to finish what we started. The syndicate will rise again, and this time, no one will be able to stop us." The Colemans felt their blood run cold. They had thought they had defeated the syndicate, but now they realized the true scope of the threat they were facing. This was a battle for the very future of their family and their company. Peter, his hand trembling slightly, spoke up. "You won't get away with this. We'll stop you just like we stopped the syndicate." Grandpa Joe's laughter echoed through the cabin, sending chills down their spines. "Oh, my dear boy, you have no idea what you're up against." With those words, he raised his gun, his finger tightening on the trigger. The Colemans braced themselves, knowing that their final confrontation with the past had begun. As the gunshot rang out, the family's world shattered. They had thought they were prepared, but nothing could have readied them for the horror that was about to unfold. In the chaos and confusion that followed, the Colemans realized that this battle was far from over. Their family's very survival now hung in the balance, and the price they would have to pay might be more than any of them were willing to bear. The future had never looked so uncertain, and the Colemans found themselves staring into the abyss, unsure of whether they would emerge victorious or be consumed by the darkness of their family's past. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the cabin, shattering the tense silence. The Colemans braced themselves, their hearts pounding in their chests. But the pain never came. Instead, they watched in horror as Grandpa Joe crumpled to the ground, a dark stain blossoming on his chest. Richard, his face a mask of fury, whirled around, searching for the source of the shot. In the doorway stood Mary, her arm still outstretched, the gun trembling in her hand. Tears streamed down her face as she met her grandfather's shocked gaze. I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. The cabin descended into chaos as the Colemans rushed to Grandpa Joe's side, desperately trying to stem the bleeding. Daniel, his face a portrait of anguish, cradled his father's head in his lap. "Father, why?" he choked out, his words laced with a lifetime of unanswered questions. Grandpa Joe's lips moved, but no sound came out. His eyes, once filled with manipulation and cruelty, now held a glimmer of something that resembled regret. As the life drained from Grandpa Joe's body, the Colemans were left reeling, their emotions a swirling mix of relief, grief, and disbelief. Whatever happened next? There was no turning back now. We have one more amazing episode to go. If you've enjoyed the story so far, please drop a comment below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell notification so you won't miss any updates. Peter, his voice barely above a whisper, turned to Mary. "What have you done?" Mary's shoulders shook with sobs. I couldn't let him hurt us, not after everything we've been through." John placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression unreadable. He was our family, Mary, no matter what he's done." The siblings exchanged anguished glances, their unity shaken by the weight of Mary's actions. In the midst of this chaos, they had lost not just their grandfather, but a piece of their own collective heart. Richard, his eyes wild with rage, lunged at Mary, his hands closing around her throat. "You bitch!" he screamed. "You've ruined everything." Peter and John rushed to Mary's aid, wrestling Richard to the ground. The cabin descended into a desperate, violent struggle as the family fought to subdue their uncle. Finally, with Richard restrained and Peter's shirt stained with blood, the Colemans stood back, their chests heaving. The gravity of what had just occurred settled over them like a heavy blanket. Daniel, his face a mask of grief and conflict, spoke up, his voice barely audible. "We need to get out of here, now." As they carried Grandpa Joe's lifeless body from the cabin and fled the scene, the Colemans knew that their world had been irreversibly shattered. The ghosts of their past had come back to haunt them, and the consequences of their actions would reverberate for years to come. The drive back to the city was a silent, somber affair. Mary sat in the back seat, her eyes red from crying, her hands trembling. The others stole glances at her, their expressions a mix of sympathy and judgment. Peter, his knuckles white from gripping the steering wheel, finally spoke up. "What are we going to do?" John, his brow furrowed in thought, answered, "We need to get ahead of this. The authorities will be looking for us, and the syndicate will be baying for our blood." Sarah reached over and squeezed Peter's arm. "We have to stick together, no matter what." The siblings nodded in silent agreement, their determination hardening in the face of this new crisis. But the weight of Grandpa Joe's death hung heavy over them, a constant reminder of the price they had paid. As they pulled into the driveway of the family mansion, Daniel turned to face them, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and resolve. "This is where it ends," he said, his voice firm. "We'll use every resource we have to protect this family, to bring down the syndicate for good. But first, we need to decide how to handle what happened back there." The Colemans exchanged solemn glances, each of them grappling with the gravity of the situation. They knew that their choices in the coming days would shape the course of their family's future. And the weight of that responsibility was overwhelming. As they stepped into the mansion, the doors closing behind them, the Colemans steeled themselves for the battle ahead. They had faced adversity before, but this time the stakes were higher than ever. The fight to save their family had only just begun. In the days that followed, the Colemans worked tirelessly to stay one step ahead of the authorities and the syndicate. They knew that their grandfather's death would be a rallying cry for their enemies, and they had to be prepared. John and Sarah spearheaded the effort to control the narrative, using their media connections to paint a picture of a family in mourning, unfairly targeted by a criminal organization. Meanwhile, the twins, Mike and Tom, fortified the company's security measures, anticipating retaliation. Peter and Daniel, with the help of their legal team, worked to ensure that Grandpa Joe's death was classified as a justifiable act of self-defense. They knew that the truth, if revealed, would only further complicate an already delicate situation. As for Mary, she remained sequestered in the mansion, her guilt and anguish consuming her. The others tried to offer comfort and support, but the weight of her actions had created a rift between her and the rest of the family. One evening, as the siblings gathered in the study, Peter turned to Mary, his eyes filled with a mix of sympathy and resolve. "Mary, we need to talk about what happened." Mary's eyes, red-rimmed from crying, met his gaze. I don't know what to say. I keep seeing his face, the look in his eyes. I didn't mean to kill him, Sarah moved to her sister's side, wrapping her in a tight embrace. "We know, Mary. We know you didn't have a choice, but we need to figure out how to move forward." John cleared his throat, his expression solemn. "The authorities are closing in. They're going to want answers, and we need to be prepared." Mary's eyes widened with fear. "Are they going to arrest me?" Peter shook his head. We won't let that happen, but we need to decide how we're going to handle this. As a family, the siblings fell silent, the weight of their decision hanging heavy in the air. They knew that whatever course of action they chose, the consequences would be far-reaching, and the risk of fracturing their family even further was ever present. As the night wore on, the Colemans huddled together, their voices low and urgent. The future of their family, their company, and their very freedom hung in the balance. And for the first time, they weren't sure if they had the strength to overcome the challenges that lay ahead. The Coleman family sat in tense silence, the weight of their decision bearing down on them. Mary's anguished gaze darted between her siblings, her hands trembling. Peter cleared his throat, breaking the oppressive hush that had fallen over the room. "All right, we need to decide how to handle this. The authorities are closing in, and the syndicate is still out there, waiting to strike." John, his brow furrowed in concentration, spoke up. "We have two options. We can either turn Mary in and try to cut a deal, or we can find a way to bury this and protect her." Sarah reached across the table, grasping Mary's hand. "Mary, I know this has been devastating, but we're your family. We're not going to abandon you." Mary's eyes filled with tears. "But what I did, I killed our own grandfather. How can you even look at me?" Daniel, who had been silent until now, placed a gentle hand on Mary's shoulder. "Mary, you did what you had to do to protect this family. None of us are blameless in this." The siblings exchanged solemn glances, the guilt and anguish etched on each of their faces. Peter leaned forward, his gaze determined. "We're going to bury this. We'll use every resource we have to make sure the authorities never find out the truth." John nodded in agreement. "It won't be easy, but we're in this together. No one is going to take Mary away from us." As the plan took shape, the Colemans threw themselves into the task with a renewed sense of purpose. They knew the risks, the potential consequences, but the thought of losing Mary was unthinkable. Sarah used her media connections to plant false leads and spread misinformation, casting doubt on the official investigation. John and the twins worked tirelessly to erase any physical evidence linking the family to the cabin. Peter and Daniel negotiated with their legal team, carefully crafting a narrative that would protect Mary while still holding up under scrutiny. It was a delicate, high-stakes dance, but the Colemans were united in their determination. In the midst of the chaos, Mary kept a low profile, rarely venturing outside the mansion. The guilt that weighed on her was palpable, but her siblings refused to let her shoulder the burden alone. One evening, as Mary sat alone in her room, a soft knock came at the door. She opened it to find Sarah standing there, a tray of steaming tea in her hands. "Hey," Sarah said softly, offering Mary a sympathetic smile. "I thought you could use a little company." Mary's eyes filled with tears as she stepped aside, allowing Sarah to enter. The two sisters sat together in silence, the only sound the gentle sipping of the tea. Finally, Mary spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "How can you all still look at me, after what I've done?" Sarah reached out and squeezed Mary's hand. "Because you're our sister, and we love you, no matter what." Mary shook her head, the tears flowing freely now. "But I killed him, Sarah. I killed Grandpa Joe. How can that ever be forgiven?" Sarah pulled Mary into a tight embrace, her own tears mingling with her sister's. "It will take time, Mary, but we're going to get through this, together, as a family." The sisters held each other, their bond stronger than the weight of their shared tragedy. In that moment, Mary felt a glimmer of hope, a reminder that she was not alone in her struggle. As the weeks passed, the Colemans' plan began to bear fruit. The authorities, though suspicious, found no concrete evidence to link the family to the cabin incident. The syndicate, distracted by the fallout and the loss of their key members, seemed to have retreated for the time being. The family breathed a collective sigh of relief, but they knew that the danger had not passed. The syndicate was a formidable enemy, and they would not rest until they had exacted their revenge. One evening, as the Colemans gathered for a rare family dinner, a sense of cautious optimism hung in the air. They had weathered the storm, at least for now, and they were determined to use this respite to regroup and strengthen their defenses. But just as they were about to sit down, a sharp knock at the door shattered the relative calm. Peter, his expression wary, moved to answer it, the others trailing behind him. As he pulled open the door, a hush fell over the room. Standing on the threshold, his face a mask of cold determination, was Jack. "We need to talk," he said, his voice tinged with a hint of urgency. "The syndicate, they're coming." The Colemans exchanged a horrified glance, their hard-won sense of security crumbling in an instant. They had thought they had won, but it seemed their battle was far from over. As Jack stepped inside, the weight of his words hung heavy in the air. The syndicate had regrouped, and they were coming for the Coleman family with a vengeance. The Colemans braced themselves, their unity and resolve tested once again. They had faced so many challenges, overcome so many obstacles, but this time the stakes were higher than ever before. With a deep breath, Peter turned to his family, his expression grim but unwavering. "Then we'll be ready for them." The Coleman family gathered around the table, their faces etched with a mix of determination and trepidation. Jack's warning had shaken them to the core, shattering the fragile sense of security they had worked so hard to rebuild. Peter, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation, addressed the group. "All right, we need to figure out our next move. The syndicate is coming, and we need to be ready." John, ever the pragmatist, jumped in. "We need to shore up our defenses, both physically and legally. We can't afford any weak spots." The twins, Mike and Tom, exchanged a look. "We've been working on upgrading the security systems, but we'll need to double our efforts," Mike said. Sarah, her brow furrowed in concentration, spoke up. "I've been working with my media contacts to keep the public eye off of us as much as possible. But we need to be prepared for a full-scale PR battle." Mary, her eyes downcast, remained silent. The weight of her actions at the cabin still hung heavily over her, and she couldn't help but wonder if her family's current predicament was somehow her fault. Daniel, sensing his daughter's inner turmoil, placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Mary, this is not your burden to bear. We're in this together as a family." Mary nodded, her lips trembling. "I just don't want to be the one who puts you all in danger again." Peter reached across the table, grasping Mary's hand. "Mary, you're not alone in this. We made the choice to protect you, and we stand by that decision." The family fell silent, the gravity of their situation palpable. They had faced so many challenges, and now they found themselves once again staring down the barrel of a crisis that threatened to tear them apart. Jack, who had been observing the exchange, cleared his throat. "I have some intel on the syndicate's movements. They're regrouping, but it seems they're still missing a key piece to their puzzle." The Colemans turned their attention to Jack, their eyes filled with a mix of hope and trepidation. "What do you mean?" John asked, his voice low. Jack shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "From what I've gathered, they're still looking for something, or someone, and they believe that person is linked to our family." The room erupted in a cacophony of voices, each sibling trying to make sense of Jack's revelation. Peter raised his hand, silencing the group. "Okay, Jack, what do you know? And how can we use this to our advantage?" Jack took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping across the family. "I think they're looking for Grandpa Joe, or more specifically, whatever secrets he was keeping." The mention of their grandfather sent a chill through the room. The Colemans exchanged uneasy glances, the memory of Grandpa Joe's deception and their confrontation at the cabin still raw and painful. "But Grandpa Joe is dead," Sarah said, her voice tinged with confusion. "How could he still be a part of their plans?" Jack shook his head. "I don't know the details, but the syndicate seems to believe there's more to the story. Something Grandpa Joe was hiding, even from us." Peter ran a hand through his hair, his brow furrowed in thought. All right, then we need to find out what that is. Whatever Grandpa Joe was hiding, it could be the key to taking the syndicate down for good. The family fell silent, the weight of their decision palpable. Delving into their grandfather's past was not a path they had expected to take, but the stakes were too high to ignore. Mary, her voice soft but resolute, spoke up. "I'll do it. I'll find out what Grandpa Joe was hiding." The others turned to her, their expressions a mix of surprise and concern. "Mary, are you sure?" Daniel asked, his voice laced with worry. "After what happened at the cabin?" Mary nodded, her eyes shining with determination. "I have to do this, Dad. For all of us. I need to make things right." Peter reached across the table, squeezing Mary's hand. "We're with you, Mary. Whatever you find, we'll face it together." The Colemans steeled themselves, their unity forged in the face of adversity. They knew that uncovering Grandpa Joe's secrets could unearth truths they weren't prepared to face, but they were willing to take the risk. As they began to formulate their plan, a sense of purpose and resolve filled the room. The syndicate had threatened their family for the last time, and the Colemans were determined to put an end to their machinations once and for all. With Mary at the helm of their investigation, the family set out to uncover the mysteries of their past, hoping that the answers would provide the key to their future. The road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but they were united in their commitment to protect their family, no matter the cost. As the sun set over the Coleman mansion, a new chapter in their story began to unfold, one that would test the limits of their strength, their resilience, and their unwavering bond as a family. The Coleman family gathered around the table, their eyes fixed on Mary as she presented her findings. The weight of Grandpa Joe's secrets hung heavy in the air, a tangled web of lies and deceit that threatened to unravel their family's very foundation. "From what I've found," Mary began, her voice trembling slightly, "Grandpa Joe was deeply involved with the syndicate, even before he faked his own death." The siblings exchanged uneasy glances, their hands clenching into fists. Peter leaned forward, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Go on, Mary. What else did you uncover?" Mary took a deep breath and continued. "It seems Grandpa Joe was one of the founding members of the syndicate. He brought in Richard and several other disgruntled business executives, promising them a way to take down their competitors and seize control of the industry." Sarah's eyes widened in horror. But why? Why would he do that? Daniel, his face etched with sorrow and disappointment, spoke up. "Power, greed. He always craved more, no matter the cost." John shook his head, his lips pressed into a thin line. "So he faked his own death to avoid the consequences of his actions." Mary nodded, her gaze downcast. "Yes, and he used that as leverage over Dad and the rest of us. He threatened to expose the family's involvement if we didn't cooperate with the syndicate's plans." The room fell silent, the weight of this revelation settling over the Colemans like a suffocating blanket. They had thought they were fighting against an external threat, but now they realized the true enemy had been lurking within their own family all along. Peter, his expression grim, broke the silence. "So what does the syndicate want now? If Grandpa Joe is dead, why are they still after us?" Mary's eyes met her brother's, her voice barely above a whisper. "They believe Grandpa Joe left behind something, some kind of leverage or evidence that could bring down the syndicate for good." The Colemans exchanged a horrified glance, the realization dawning on them. "They think we have it," John breathed, his face pale. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed in deep thought. "We need to find whatever it is Grandpa Joe was hiding before the syndicate does." The family fell silent, each of them grappling with the weight of this new information. The ghosts of their past had come back to haunt them, and the consequences of their grandfather's actions threatened to consume them all. As they began to formulate a plan, a sense of urgency and determination settled over the room. They had come too far, fought too hard, to let the syndicate win. Mary, her eyes filled with a renewed sense of purpose, spoke up. "I'll keep digging, see if I can uncover any more clues about what Grandpa Joe was hiding." Peter reached across the table, his hand clasping Mary's. "We're with you, Mary. We'll find a way to stop the syndicate, once and for all." The siblings nodded in agreement, their unity strengthened by the gravity of the situation. They knew that the path ahead would be treacherous, but they were ready to face it head-on, united as a family. In the days that followed, Mary immersed herself in the family archives, scouring every inch of their history for any trace of Grandpa Joe's secrets. The others worked tirelessly to shore up their defenses, anticipating the syndicate's next move. As the investigation progressed, the Colemans braced themselves for the possibility that the truth they uncovered might be more than they could bear. The thought of their grandfather's betrayal, the extent of his deception, weighed heavily on their hearts. One evening, as Mary sat hunched over a stack of old documents, her eyes red from exhaustion, she let out a sudden gasp. The others rushed to her side, their hearts pounding in their chests. "I found it," Mary whispered, her voice trembling. "I know what Grandpa Joe was hiding." The Colemans gathered around her, their faces etched with a mix of trepidation and determination. Whatever Mary had discovered, they were ready to face it, united in their resolve to protect their family. As Mary began to reveal the shocking details of Grandpa Joe's past, the family listened in stunned silence. The revelations were gut-wrenching, shattering their preconceptions about the man they had once revered. But amidst the darkness, a glimmer of hope emerged. The information Mary had uncovered could be the key to bringing down the syndicate once and for all. The Colemans knew that the road ahead would be treacherous, but they were prepared to take the risk. With a renewed sense of purpose, the family set out to confront their past and secure their future. They had faced countless challenges, but this was the ultimate test of their unity and strength. As they braced themselves for the final showdown, the Colemans knew that the fate of their family, their legacy, and the very fabric of their lives hung in the balance. They had come too far to back down now, and they were determined to emerge victorious no matter the cost. Mary's hand shook as she held the faded photograph. Her siblings leaned in, their eyes wide with shock. The picture showed Grandpa Joe standing next to a man they all recognized, Richard, the current leader of the syndicate. This changes everything," Peter whispered, his voice cracking. Sarah grabbed the photo, her fingers tracing the outlines of the two men. "They look friendly, like they've known each other for years." John slammed his fist on the table, making everyone jump. That backstabbing old man, he wasn't just involved with the syndicate. He was best friends with their leader. Daniel tried to calm his brother down. "We don't know the whole story yet. Let's not jump to conclusions." Mary cleared her throat, her face pale. "There's more. I found a letter. It's from Richard to Grandpa Joe, dated just a week before Grandpa faked his death." She pulled out a wrinkled piece of paper and began to read. "Joe, we've come too far to back out now. The plan is in motion. Your death will throw them off our scent. Remember, once it's done, there's no turning back. The Coleman Empire will be ours, and your family will never know the truth. Richard." A heavy silence fell over the room. The weight of betrayal pressed down on them, suffocating and overwhelming. Sarah broke down, tears streaming down her face. How could he do this to us? To Dad, we trusted him. Peter put an arm around his sister, trying to comfort her while fighting back his own tears. We were just pawns in his game, all this time, Mary continued, her voice barely above a whisper. There's something else, a series of numbers and letters at the bottom of the letter. It looks like a code or a location. John perked up, his anger momentarily forgotten. A location? You think that's where Grandpa hid whatever the syndicate is after? Before anyone could answer, a loud crash echoed through the house. The sound of breaking glass and heavy footsteps filled the air. They're here, Daniel shouted, jumping to his feet. "We need to go now." The siblings scrambled, grabbing what they could. Mary clutched the letter and photo to her chest as they ran towards the back door. Just as they reached the exit, a figure stepped out of the shadows, blocking their path. The siblings froze, their hearts pounding. "Well, well, well," a smooth voice drawled. "The Coleman children all grown up and still causing trouble?" Richard, the leader of the syndicate, stood before them, a cruel smile playing on his lips. Behind him, several armed men filed into the room, their weapons trained on the family. "I must say, you've led us on quite the chase," Richard continued, his eyes gleaming with malice. "But playtime is over. Hand over what Joe left behind, and maybe, just maybe, I'll let you live." Peter stepped forward, shielding his siblings. "We don't have anything, and even if we did, we'd never give it to you." Richard's smile widened, sending chills down their spines. "Oh, but you do have something. You just don't know it yet." He turned to Mary, his gaze zeroing in on the papers clutched in her hands. "Those look interesting. Mind if I take a look?" Mary backed away, her grip tightening on the documents. John and Daniel moved to stand beside Peter, forming a protective wall in front of their sisters. "You're not getting anything from us," John growled, his fists clenched at his sides. Richard sighed, shaking his head in mock disappointment. "I was hoping we could do this the easy way, but if you insist on being difficult..." He nodded to his men, who raised their weapons. Just as tension reached its breaking point, the room plunged into darkness. The sound of shattering glass filled the air, followed by a series of loud pops and flashes. Chaos erupted. The Coleman siblings felt hands grabbing them, pulling them towards the back door. A voice they didn't recognize shouted, "Come with us if you want to live." Without time to think, they allowed themselves to be led out of the house and into a waiting van. As they sped away, explosions rocked the night behind them. Catching their breath, the siblings huddled together in the back of the van, their minds reeling from the sudden turn of events. Who are you?" Sarah finally managed to ask, her voice trembling. The driver, a woman with short, cropped hair and intense eyes, glanced at them in the rearview mirror. "We're friends of your father. He set us up as a failsafe in case things ever went south." Peter leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Our father? But he's been dead for years." The woman's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "That's what you were meant to believe. Your father is very much alive, and he's been working to bring down the syndicate from the inside." The siblings exchanged shocked glances, their world tilting on its axis once again. But why?" Mary stammered, her mind struggling to process this new information. "Why would he let us believe he was dead?" The woman's eyes softened slightly. "To protect you. The less you knew, the safer you were. At least that was the plan." As they drove through the night, the Coleman siblings tried to wrap their heads around this latest revelation. Their grandfather a traitor, it was almost too much to bear. Hours later, they arrived at a secluded cabin deep in the woods. As they filed out of the van, exhausted and overwhelmed, a figure stepped out onto the porch. The siblings froze, their eyes wide with disbelief. It was their dad. He hugged them all, crying. Then Grandpa Joe came out too. Everyone was shocked. Joe explained he faked being evil to trick the syndicate. He and their dad had been working together all along to bring the bad guys down. Suddenly, Richard and his men surrounded the cabin. It looked hopeless, but then Joe smiled and pressed a button. Hundreds of police cars appeared from nowhere. The whole thing was a trap. Richard was angry. He tried to shoot Joe, but the gun didn't work. Joe laughed and said he had switched all their bullets for fake ones. The police arrested all the bad guys. The Coleman family was safe at last. They had lots to talk about and many years to make up for. As they went inside the cabin, Joe winked at his grandkids. "Who wants to hear about the time I pretended to be a pirate to catch a diamond thief?" he asked. The siblings laughed, realizing their family adventures were far from over. Thanks for watching from the beginning of this story down to the end. Please don't forget to subscribe to this channel to stay updated with our latest releases. We truly appreciate your love and support so far. See you in our next release.